It all started with a single phone call, a frantic, late-night message from my brother's commanding officer, who had just received an unsettling email from a military family support liaison. My brother's house, the one he had saved for, the one he had planned his future around, had been auctioned off by the very HOA that was supposed to protect the neighborhood. My brother, Jason, had been deployed overseas for 8 months, serving his country with unwavering dedication, oblivious to the disaster that had unfolded back home. When I checked the emails forwarded to me, I saw the notices, cold, bureaucratic letters citing unpaid HOA fees of a few $100s as justification for seizing and selling his home to the highest bidder. I knew something was off immediately. Jason had set up auto pay for all his bills before leaving. He was meticulous about it, ensuring that no financial loose ends would come back to haunt him while he was stationed thousands of miles away. How, then, had this happened? My first instinct was disbelief, followed by pure, unfiltered rage. I called the HOA office, demanding answers, only to be met with a dismissive response from a snide-sounding woman who barely concealed her boredom as she told me, "The auction was legal. Your brother should have been more responsible." Responsible? My brother was dodging bullets in a war zone while these vultures were picking apart his life from the safety of an air-conditioned office. I wasn't going to let this slide. I drove straight to his neighborhood, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. When I arrived, I saw a sold sign staked into the front lawn of Jason's house, a home he had poured his heart into, where we had shared countless family memories, where he had planned to return after deployment and finally settle down. I stormed into the HOA office, my anger barely contained, demanding to see the paperwork that had allowed them to commit this blatant theft. They handed me a file, a disgustingly thin one, filled with legal jargon designed to confuse and intimidate. But I wasn't fooled. I saw the inconsistencies immediately. The HOA had failed to notify Jason properly. Their so-called official letters had been sent to an old address he hadn't lived at in years, despite them having his correct deployment contact information on file. Worse, they had expedited the foreclosure process, bypassing several required legal steps. The more I dug, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate, a scheme. And Jason wasn't their only victim. I had always heard horror stories about predatory homeowners associations, but I never thought I'd be fighting one on behalf of my brother while he was deployed, powerless to defend himself. The more I looked into the situation, the more it became clear that this wasn't just an issue of negligence or bureaucratic red tape. This was calculated theft. The HOA had taken advantage of a technicality, pushed through the foreclosure process in record time, and sold Jason's house to one of their own insiders at a fraction of its worth. The new owner, a smug real estate investor named Rick Maddox, had picked it up for pennies on the dollar at a rigged auction, and he had wasted no time in trying to flip it for profit. I dug through public records and saw a disturbing pattern. This wasn't the first time this had happened. Over the past 3 years, at least 5 other homes in the neighborhood had been foreclosed on under similarly shady circumstances, all over small unpaid fees, all sold at absurdly low prices to the same handful of people. It was a racket, and they had gotten away with it because most of their victims had been either elderly, non-native English speakers or, like my brother, deployed military personnel who weren't around to fight back. But this time, they had picked the wrong family to mess with. The first thing I did was contact Jason's commanding officer to formally report the issue to the Service Members Civil Relief Act, SCRA, office, a federal protection that prevents active duty service members from losing their homes due to foreclosure without a court order. The law was clear. Jason's foreclosure had been illegal. That was my leverage. But I knew that if I wanted to get real results, I needed to do more than just file paperwork. I had to expose the entire operation. So, I started gathering evidence. I tracked down the previous homeowners who had lost their houses in similar ways. One was an 82-year-old man, Miguel Ortega, whose house had been sold off over a $300 fine for excessive weeds in his yard. Another was a widowed mother of three who had missed an HOA fee payment by 2 weeks while dealing with a medical emergency. Each story was worse than the last. With every homeowner I spoke to, my anger deepened, but so did my resolve. These weren't just isolated incidents. This was systemic abuse. I needed an attorney, someone aggressive who wouldn't back down from a fight. I found a real bulldog of a lawyer, Rebecca Connors, a woman with a reputation for tearing apart corrupt housing associations. When I explained the situation, she agreed to take the case immediately, working pro bono at first because she despised HOAs as much as I did. Together, we filed a lawsuit against the HOA and the investors involved, alleging fraud, wrongful foreclosure, and violation of federal law. But I didn't stop there. I reached out to a local investigative journalist, a guy named Daniel Green, who had exposed citywide corruption before. When I laid out the evidence for him, he nearly salivated at the chance to take the story public. He started digging deeper, uncovering bank statements, internal emails, and hidden connections between the HOA board members and the real estate investors benefiting from the foreclosures. Then, I played my ace. I contacted a national military rights organization, one with political connections and media clout. The moment they heard that a deployed soldier's home had been stolen illegally, they jumped into action. The story went viral within days. News outlets picked it up, social media exploded with outrage, and the HOA found itself under a national microscope. People started digging up dirt on them. Past lawsuits, shady financial dealings, even a few bribery allegations involving city officials. Under pressure, the HOA board tried to deflect, claiming it was an unfortunate clerical error, but it was too late. The state attorney general launched an investigation, and subpoenas were issued. I wasn't just going to get Jason's house back. I was going to burn their entire empire to the ground. With the lawsuit in full swing and the media hammering the HOA's corruption, I knew I had them cornered, but I wasn't satisfied yet. I wanted to make sure they not only paid for what they did to Jason, but that they would never be able to pull this scheme on anyone else again. The lawsuit had gained so much attention that additional victims came forward, dozens of them. Each one had a horror story about fraudulent fines, wrongful foreclosures, and outright harassment by the HOA. Some had lost their homes. Others had been forced to pay thousands in bogus fees just to keep their properties. The more we uncovered, the more it became clear that this wasn't just a local scam. It was a network of fraud spanning multiple neighborhoods, all connected to the same corrupt board members and real estate investors. As the lawsuit progressed, the pressure on the HOA board intensified. Their legal team tried to bury us in paperwork, hoping we'd give up. But Rebecca, our attorney, was relentless. She uncovered internal emails proving that the HOA had deliberately targeted military families and the elderly, knowing they were less likely to fight back. That alone was enough to escalate our case to federal court. Meanwhile, the state attorney general had launched a full-fledged investigation into the HOA's financial dealings, and things were not looking good for them. Then came the breaking point. A whistleblower, a former HOA employee, reached out to us, providing a treasure trove of documents that detailed years of fraudulent activity. These documents contained evidence of forged signatures on foreclosure documents, emails proving collusion between the HOA board and the real estate investors, financial records showing embezzlement of HOA funds for personal use. With the smoking gun in hand, we went public again. The whistleblower did a televised interview, and the HOA's reputation imploded overnight. Angry homeowners held protests, demanding resignations. The state froze the HOA's assets, preventing them from taking any more homes. The investors who had profited from the scheme were now under investigation for fraud and racketeering. Still, I wasn't done. I wanted personal accountability. So, I worked with law enforcement to ensure that not only would the HOA be sued, but its board members would face criminal charges. Sure enough, within a few months, the HOA president and 2 other board members were arrested for fraud and conspiracy. The real estate investor, Rick Maddox, the one who had bought Jason's home, was indicted for participating in the scheme. As part of the settlement, every stolen home, including Jason's, had to be returned to its rightful owner. When I handed Jason back the keys to his house, he was speechless. He had expected a nightmare waiting for him after deployment, but instead, he returned to see justice served. Not only did he get his home back, but a new HOA was formed with strict protections to prevent anything like this from happening again. The corrupt board members were ruined. Some were facing years in prison. Others were bankrupt from the lawsuits. The final nail in the coffin came when the military organization that had backed us used this case to push for stronger legal protections for deployed soldiers nationwide. New policies were introduced, making it nearly impossible for HOAs to foreclose on active duty military personnel without going through extensive legal hurdles. What started as a personal fight for my brother turned into a national victory against HOA corruption. In the end, we didn't just win. We destroyed them.